Thank you very much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic on working? Fab. Oh, well, thank you so much for the introduction, for organising the event in this amazing space. It's the first time I've been here, but what a wonderful venue. And thank you to my co-panelists rather than anything else, I think. And thank you everyone for coming on this very sort of drizzly, dark January evening. It's really humbling and an honour that lots of people want to come and talk about the topic African climate futures. So this is the book that I'm going to be talking about. There's probably only one copy in the building, but this is what we're going to talk about. And my book is about why reading climate fiction in general, and then specifically why reading African climate fiction might be important and helpful and politically stimulating for thinking about how to radically reimagine sustainable futures. And what I try to do in the book is to read official governmental policy strategies, net zero, long-term low carbon strategies, alongside climate fiction, novels, short stories and films. And the argument that I try to make is that in contrast to the limited, problematic storylines we get in some of the official strategies, African futurist climate fiction can help us to understand the debts we all might owe, think about what sort of reparations might be possible, explore the contours of living convivially alongside more than human others in climate-changed futures. So, as was said in the introduction, I'm a senior lecturer in the politics department at Manchester. My first book was on the UN and a World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa, and so I've been teaching and researching on African environmental politics and environmental activism in South Africa and elsewhere for about 20 years now, and this latest project is a bit of a departure for me, but moving into the reading political strategies alongside fictional texts. So one of the main debates that I try to engage with in the book is the question of why we should read climate fiction at all, politically. In a moment where the materiality of the climate crisis is becoming more and more evident to all of us, and politics is sometimes thought of as being about hard-headed realism, why should we be interested in reading climate fiction? And there's a huge, ongoing, long-standing debate here. Jade's work has made important contributions to this as well. But at a time when climate fiction or fiction is sometimes argued to be something of a diversion or a distraction of a form of escapism, I wanted to ask, well, what might be some of the political arguments for reading climate fiction? And one argument that we often get, sometimes coming from climate scientists or policymakers, is that artists and storytellers are needed to help communicate the science of climate change, perhaps to publics who either don't understand enough or don't care enough about climate politics. And in the current conjuncture, perhaps there's an argument for this quite instrumental or even sort of propagandic role of fiction, but I have a number of issues with this argument. Firstly, I think it rests on an assumption that this is why net zero transitions are stalling, that people don't understand or care enough, and I don't think that's the case. There are structural, political reasons why net zero politics is not moving fast enough. Secondly, I think the empirical evidence about what the effects of reading climate fiction is mixed, to say the least. I mean, it's simply not the case that we can assume that reading lots of climate fiction makes you a better climate activist or policymaker or understand the science better. Thirdly, probably most important, I think this instrumental argument misses out on what I think are some of the most important, or dare I even say, sort of profound reasons for reading fiction and literature. So what are some of those? There are lots of things, obviously, fiction can do. One thing is encourage empathy. This is often one of the classic arguments about reading fiction, that it asks you to stand in someone else's shoes and see the world from their perspective. Maybe interestingly, in some of these stories, even to imagine what a non-human perspective on climate politics might be, and I think this is really important in the context of the climate crisis. Another important political role of fiction is for democracy, a vibrant public sphere where we read and discuss and debate lots of different alternative viewpoints, perhaps in meetings and settings sort of like this, is often argued to be quite a crucial function for a plural agonistic public sphere, which is really important, not just for the means, but also for the ends of any transition. What sort of society do we think we might be living in the future? But the heart of what I try to do in this book is to read fiction as a resource for critique, as a resource for critical thinking. So what can reading speculative fiction do for thinking critically? And this is one of the ways in which speculative and utopian fiction has often been treated as a resource or even as a form of critical theorizing. But the argument that art can hold a mirror up to society, that it can encourage self-reflection, that it can be a form of, or assist with diagnosis of the ills of society. Even fiction that's set in a far future or fantastical other worlds. And this role is perhaps less about the far future and more about defamiliarizing or estranging us from the society around us. So we can read a far future fantastical fictional story about a future classless society, and then we look around us and see the class divisions in our own society and might ask deeper questions about how it's come to be that way. And this is the reason why utopian and speculative and science fiction has been such a important resource for critical theorists, Marxists, feminists, black theory, queer theory, and so on. Now, all of this, I should stress, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not suggesting in the climate crisis all we need to do is read and write better climate stories, or that all climate fiction is necessarily politically helpful. I think what I'm trying to do in the book is try to ask questions about what sorts of climate fiction might be useful in what sorts of ways in imaginatively enhancing resources for a just transition or a different ecological imaginary. I'm sure lots of people have, hopefully people are here because you're interested in climate fiction and you want to talk about the examples you've read. I'm sure lots of people are aware that this is, by all accounts, a booming sector. There's lots of anthologies and prizes, and lots of work is now being explicitly marketed as climate fiction. I came across a stat the other day that claimed that 3.5% of all the fiction published last year was categorized explicitly as climate fiction. I'm not sure exactly how you count that or if that's important. Other people argue that all fiction must be climate fiction because it takes place in the context of climate change. And the fact that people are explicitly writing and reading what they describe as climate fiction makes sense, of course. I mean, the extreme weather events, this growing sense of an ecological crisis, the politics of the Anthropocene, the expansion of renewable energy at the same time at which fossil fuel exploitation is not contracting in the way it needs to be, and the anxiety and frustration I'm sure lots of people, I know I certainly feel at contemporary climate politics, I think is one of the reasons why people turn to read and write climate fiction. And within all of that, there are examples of prominent African authors and settings and stories of climate fiction. Last year, Abidare, a Nigerian author, won the first climate fiction prize for the novel And So I Roar. But I think the reason why I wanted to write this book is because I think that within the field of climate fiction and within broader global climate politics, African authors, settings, characters, stories, visions of the future are quite often marginalised. They tend to be made invisible in global climate politics, with the exception of a kind of cliched, stereotypical, dystopian vision in which African presence are somehow held to be symbolic of a threatened global future of conflict and desertification and famine and so on. Whereas I wanted to use the research to explore the diversity, the radicalism, the countercultural potential, the many different vibrant stories that are emerging from African authors and African forms of climate fiction. Not just because of the argument about representation, but I think that's really important too. But also, I think the argument I try to make in the book is that African futurist climate fiction can radically challenge how we imagine the places, the ecologies, the temporalities, and the politics of climate futures. And the book is organised thematically, at least the second half of the book, in terms of the places, the ecologies, the temporalities, and the politics of climate futures. very happy to talk more about those if people want. But in the interest of time, and because I love that this is organised as a conversation rather than a monologue, I'm going to. I just thought I would talk about one of those stories that I discuss in the book as just an example, draw out some of the implications of that, and then we can have this as a proper conversation. So I actually thought I would start by reading the introduction to, I can manage my hands, this book, Nnedi Okorafor's 2014 book, Lagoon. For those of you who know or don't know, Nnedi Okorafor, a Nigerian-American author, quite well known in speculative and fantasy circles, one of the authors for Black Panther and so on. So I'll just read the opening of this book. So the first chapter is called Moom, M-O-O-M. She slices through the water, imagining herself a deadly beam of black light. The current parts against her sleek, smooth skin. If any fish gets in her way, she'll spear it and keep right on going. She is on a mission, she is angry. She will succeed, and then they will leave for good. They brought the stench of dryness, then they brought the noise and made the world bleed black ooze that left poison rainbows on the water's surface. She often sees these rainbows whenever she leaps over the water to touch the sun. Inhaling them stings and burns her gills. The ones who bring the rainbows are burrowing and building creatures from the land, and no one can do anything about them, except her. She's done it before, and they stopped for many moons. They went away. She is doing it again. So this is the story of an alien arrival in the waters of Lagos, in Lagos Lagoon. The alien arrival and the alien civilization interacts with an extensive range of human and non-human characters in Lagos in order to bring about a social, political, ecological, economic, cultural transformation. And the range of non-human and post-human and more than human characters in this story is one of the things that make it distinctive. In the opening example, the narrator is a swordfish. We start with a swordfish's perspective, and the alien arrival interacts just as much with and is as transformative for the swordfish as for the human characters in the story. And the swordfish goes on to attack an oil pipeline. So this is a piece of speculative petrofiction. It's not explicitly or directly about climate change, but it raises issues of extraction and ecological harm, and also adaptation and social and political transformation that I think are really relevant to climate politics. And I just want to make 4 points, implications that I've drawn from this story. Firstly is that we should look to African cities like Lagos, which are so often relatively ignored in climate change discussions, for visions of climate changed, Afrocentric global futures. The second implication is that restoring better ethical relations between humans and non-humans should be central to climate politics. So the start of the book opens with the swordfish perspective, Act 2 starts with the tarantula's perspective, Act 3 from a bat's perspective. And we end up with this kind of utopian conclusion in which there's a transformation to some kind of post-capitalist, ecologically balanced society. We don't get a lot of details about this. The president of Nigeria's vision is that this will be a society of renewed institutions, empowered experts, alien technology, and the flourishing of relations with the land and waters, and that Nigeria will become a model for a new way of living. The third implication is that I think, or at least I read this story as insisting that embracing human difference, racial, gendered, sexual, differently abled, neurodiverse, will be vital in coming to terms with changing climate. So one example of this from the story, the aliens are shapeshifters. They enlist the help of 3 human characters who also turn out to be shapeshifters or to have more than human special abilities and powers. And one of the subplots of the book is there's a student LGBT group who capture on video one of the aliens shapeshifting. And they immediately recognize the power of the message. That's a person changing into another person. It would have been better if it was a woman changing to a man, but this will do. We could have some fun sending this around. We can come out of secrecy for this. Who better to understand us than a shapeshifter? Fourth, the stories like Lagoon emphasise the importance of imagining future, convivial, even utopian societies, but societies in which politics and violence and power relations haven't disappeared and gone away. And a lot of the literature on Lagoon emphasises the utopian conclusion, whereas this is a story with a lot of violence and mayhem, and encounters with the other are difficult and violent and destructive. And keeping that in mind, keeping the politics at the forefront of our minds when we think about even just transitions is really important, I think. It's also, it's really important, something I tried to do in the book is to read these stories critically and examine their implicit and explicit assumptions. There are tensions in this story, and in the end it finishes with quite a top-down, patriarchal vision, almost conservative vision of political change, driven by the president of Nigeria. I think there's a way in which even quite radical and revolutionary imaginaries can be co-opted by existing power relations and institutions. Despite this, there is a subversive central message of the book, which is that even in the corners of palaces, spiders dwell. And I think this is really nice to hold on to when we're thinking about political transitions. So I'm just going to end my comments with two takeaways. The first, perhaps the most simple and straightforward takeaway from the book, is that the marginalisation of African authors and stories from most discussions about climate futures is unjust, and if we want a fairer, more representative, more diverse set of discussions about climate futures, then we need to hear more African voices. And I'm very well aware of the tension in that coming from me as a white male, English-speaking British academic. And one of the reasons for writing the book is the hope that at the very least it can do something to amplify the fantastic work that's academics and fictional authors are doing to think about alternative climate futures. The second takeaway is that, of course, as I said at the start, fictional narratives don't have all the answers. Fiction also works to obscure and omit issues. Popular culture, I think, more generally works to reinforce the social imaginaries that have produced the climate crisis: capitalist, consumerist, growth-oriented, neo-colonial, misogynist, racist, anthropocentric. Fiction sometimes, even progressive fiction, sometimes argues that lone heroes are the answer for climate transformation, and that's an important thing to critique. I'm really interested in the two-sided potential of fiction, which was encapsulated for me in a quote by Edward Said. He said, "Stories are at the heart of what explorers and novelists say about strange regions of the world, but they also become the method colonized people use to assert their own identity and the existence of their own history." So keeping this tension, this two-sided potential of fiction in mind, I think helps us try to make sense of how and where African futurist climate fiction or other examples of climate fiction might play a role in helping to articulate what a reparative and anti-colonial climate politics might look like. Thank you very much.
Do a bit of juggling now. Thank you so much, Carl, for that lovely summary of a book that I really enjoyed, that I found useful, lucid, engaging for all sorts of reasons. Thank you, Lucy, for the invitation. And thank you, Jade, in advance for your panel chairing. Not to put too much pressure. So I've been looking forward to this event, not only as an opportunity to read the book, to bump it to the top of the to-read list, but also to kind of, talk about it and hear what other people have thought and said about it. So one of the kind of joys of scholarship is being able to engage with the particularities of someone else's archive, someone else's kind of body of text that they've kind of assembled. And I really appreciated the kind of care with which you've assembled this set of texts, and also as a kind of window into a text that I don't know very well, alongside and contextualized with some really kind of careful genealogical work to kind of implot them with these kind of longer traditions of oral storytelling, oral traditions, the kind of Afrofuturism, and the distinction between Afrofuturism and African futurism I thought was very salient, as well as these kind of broader traditions of African literature, speculative fiction, and so thinking about Achebe, thinking about Lessing, who you do look at, but also kind of I've been writing and thinking with students with an author called Leslie Neka Arima, who is on the more kind of dystopic end of the spectrum there, but also kind of really interesting to think about how this kind of defamiliarization just turns the axis slightly and shows us something that we know in a different light. So you're really open about the sense of kind of potential exposure is the word that I've used, maybe that's fair, not fair, that comes with engaging with literature, engaging outside of your own discipline. But I actually think that this is one of the strengths of the book. And you do good work to acknowledge Timothy Clark's critique, his reservation about the kind of slightly delusional quality sometimes, the slightly kind of abstract quality that some of eco-criticism inadvertently perhaps falls into. The kind of maybe delusions about what literature can do, kind of denuded of context, denuded of political action. So this marriage between, I guess, the kind of policy, what's happening, what's shaping our lives and the narratives through which maybe we escape, but also we reimagine the world. I thought that was a really apposite kind of bringing together of two different genres. So you're reckoning there with the kind of emptiness of a kind of aesthetics or a culture without action, but also the kind of emptiness of a policy divorced from the energy and the plurality, there we go, of creative visions of the future. And I thought that was one of the more important problematics that's explored in the book. So there's so much to say and so little time to say it in. But I thought I'd just kind of respond quite personally, framing kind of three core ideas or three kind of core concepts that really kind of chimed with me, resonated with me, or emerged for me as I was reading. Yeah. So the first of these is the idea of kind of inversions, unexpected inversions. And it's a kind of diffuse idea, and I hope you'll bear with me. And what I kept on kind of coming back to in my reading was this idea that kind of comes through at the end of a slightly less inspiring example of climate fiction, The Day After Tomorrow. I'm sure you've all, yeah, there we go. But the kind of the last the third act of that film kind of turns on an inversion, an imagined inversion, after this kind of ice age has swept the kind of northern hemisphere, and the kind of wealthy northern nations are forced into this kind of mass migration as refugees to the kind of what we might call the global south. So you've got the kind of president of America giving his address from Mexico, and so an inversion of these kind of power hierarchies that we know that we kind of that exist. But also this other kind of vignette, this other kind of narrative, and that's from Caldwell Eshone's playful vignette of a team of future African archaeologists from the United States of Africa, and they're sifting through the detritus of the past in a quest to try and understand the mysteries of 21st century subjectivity. And so both of these kind of narrativizations turn upon or kind of derive their kind of thrill or frisson or whatever you want to call it from an inversion of the existing status quo, and a kind of redrawing of the map that reconfigures what was or is marginal as the kind of new centre. And I think that's what I see African Climate Futures really interested in the way that you've said about kind of refusing or rejecting these kind of tired, exhausted tropes, while acknowledging a sense of kind of very real vulnerability and risk that's borne by the kind of most economically exposed nations in the world. So thinking a bit about the kind of nation and the kind of complexity of that, the paradox of that, I found it really telling that some of the most persuasive articulations of the future-oriented policy that you examine emerge out of this kind of Pan-African kind of coalitionary context or kind of form. And this is a form of thinking that seems to exceed the logic of the border, exceed the logic of the nation state. And one of the tensions I see running through that you kind of are trying to engage with is how to acknowledge the realities of kind of national vulnerability, the environmental challenges that are unique to each kind of individual kind of nation, and their own desires for both kind of sovereignty, maybe a kind of more complex desire to be seen as perhaps a hero of a kind of international story, kind of an arc of redemption. Maybe that's a very kind of an established kind of narrative arc. But also kind of a sense of kind of resistance perhaps to kind of climate colonialism and something of a kind of lingering paternalism. So all of these kind of different kind of affects and desires all kind of in tension with one another. But also kind of the headline of how can we reconcile the kind of transnational impetus or urgency of the climate emergency with these kind of desires and I guess states of being that seem so attached to national identity. So those two things seem to be in conflict. And I thought that tension came through most strongly. So you do a really nice bit of kind of close reading of these kind of long-term strategies submitted by governments to the UNFCCC under the 2015 Paris Agreement. And I think the brilliance of that is reading kind of policy as another genre, as a genre among genres, and as a genre with its kind of own linguistic conventions, its own kind of performance of kind of bureaucracy and bureaucratic language. And I think if we were reading these perhaps in the least generous way, in a way that kind of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick calls a kind of paranoid reading, we might think about how these documents are kind of exercises in compliance, saying what's most pleasing to a kind of global audience, and in a way that kind of reproduces or kind of sustains the kind of power relationships of dependency, where these kind of nations are often, in a position of dependency, and not really. And I think you do some work to kind of really show that these are kind of outward projections that don't necessarily reckon with the needs of their own kind of populations. And those needs are really kind of complex in their own turn. And I think there's another irony here that at the moment where what we might call the global north is kind of preaching a gospel of simplicity, of a kind of a withdrawal from kind of problematic consumption. These kind of privileges of travel, energy use, and kind of symbols of social mobility are only just now coming into reach for those that we might kind of think of in the global south. So how do we reckon with that kind of irony, that inversion? That's another kind of complexity there. And that's not to say that climate action should wait until the kind of historically disenfranchised have had their turn. But I think it draws attention to this kind of exploration of hard questions that are involved in what you're calling a kind of, or what you're exploring as a kind of the ethical dimensions of a just transition. So that's really important too. And then I wanted to kind of think about this idea of inversion and what the most kind of radical inversion might look like. And I couldn't help but think of Sci-Fi on the Brain, think of Frank Herbert's Dune, Paul holding the galaxy hostage by threatening to kind of burn the spice melange film, the fields on which the whole kind of economy of the galactic economy depends. And I think some of the narratives that you're interested in are at least, if not more, radical. So I'm thinking of the Book of the Phoenix and this kind of immolation of New York, and how that really dramatizes the stakes of, I think often that the term that you might have heard, or the phrase that you might have heard, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. But what would the end of the world really look like? And what are the kind of challenges and costs of a really kind of revolutionary reparative justice? Those are questions as well that some of these narratives ask, and that your book also asks there. So moving on to the idea of the kind of affordances of genre, what these kind of speculative genres are able to do, these kind of radical inversions that they're able to perform. I was really kind of struck by this kind of question of what you're asking around what stories do politically. They're not just entertainment, they're not just escapism, but they're actually kind of a ground on which kind of forms of political theorizing can emerge, which was, I think, something that chimes with my own kind of approach to narrative, to literature. I'm thinking about increasingly, this kind of idea of storytelling as a kind of battleground on which political ground is kind of conceded or gained. 1 minute, okay, fantastic. And so just drawing attention to that and this struggle over speculation, and thinking about Cara Keeling, who draws attention to the doubleness of speculation, both as a kind of economic form of activity, but also as a kind of literary one. So that struggle for who will eventually kind of claim speculation. And then the last idea is the kind of idea of plurality, and the idea that kind of embracing difference will be vital in coming to terms with the kind of changing climates, which you explore in chapter 6. And that framework felt especially relevant to my own research. So I started thinking about kind of narratives of illness and how health is kind of really implicated in questions of environmental injustice. And how Mel Chen really critiques the idea of kind of mythic health, the fantasy of healthy, individuated bodies, unadulterated by toxins, cognitively clear, floating in this kind of suspended ether above the kind of hidden masses, classes, colours and toxins of everyone else. And that sense of kind of having to redraw what we understand as health in this kind of new context of ubiquitous microplastics. And that idea of kind of purity really needs to be drawn, and we might want to think about health more in terms of kind of a kind of relational kind of connections, and also thinking about perhaps acknowledging our interdependency. So really thinking about, well, what does health mean? It doesn't mean just that I can work. It means something quite different. So I think I'll end there and hopefully open up to a broader discussion. But yeah, some kind of thoughts that seemed to me really kind of salient, and I hope they speak to what you intended for the book also. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you as well, Lucy, and everyone for inviting me to join this evening. I can't say how delighted I am to be here with two such exciting thinkers, and we're off to such a flying, thought-provoking beginning. It's really kind of a joy to listen to you both speak. I think I have around 30 minutes or so of kind of asking questions before I hand over to you to ask yours. And I will, of course, give Carl the right to reply to Kelechi's very probing and insightful responses to the book. But to start, I just thought I'd just dial back a little bit because I'm sure there's friends and family and colleagues in the audience, but there might also be members of the public who don't know you that well. So I wondered if we could just begin first with Carl and then with Kelechi, just telling us a little bit about, first, Carl, why you decided to turn to literature. What was it about your academic and personal journey that meant you took that kind of brave step into a different discipline? And do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Thank you very much, and thanks, Kelechi, as well, for some fantastic and thought-provoking questions. Dialing back for the other, did you describe it as exposure? The exposure of moving into a different discipline, or not moving into a different discipline, but trying to do something a bit more ambitiously interdisciplinary, without letting go of kind of classic political questions about states and global governance and conflict and violence and so on. I suppose there's several answers to that. I mean, one is maybe as the political context gets bleaker and more depressing, the interest in utopian, speculative alternatives, the appeal of that is ever stronger, and I'd probably be lying to say there is no kind of dimension of escapism or in that move. You could maybe hear what other people think about that as well. I think, I've always loved, ever since I was very young, I enjoyed reading science fiction, speculative fiction. I have found that the things that I've been reading over the last decade or so have been very different from the kind of classics of the Frank Herberts and the classics of science fiction that I was reading as a teenager. And then, especially reading people like Nadia Okorafor and those kind of angry, revolutionary, political texts about justice and violence and repair and retribution, and thinking, well, there are so many parallels. I'm sure she's been reading Achille Mbembe. We must be able to bring these conversations together. And then the other aspect is more personal. I mean, my PhD research and a lot of my earlier research was field work. I don't really like that term, but going and talking to environmental activists in other parts of the world. And then I had young children, and the prospect of a lot of travel and spending a long time away from home became less attractive. And so I wanted to try and find ways of doing research that chimed with family and caregiving roles and things like that at home, and you can read a short story on your phone whilst you're walking with a sleeping child, and I was doing that for pleasure anyway. I was like, I wonder if I could get away with turning this into some parts of my professional work as well, and I'm just delighted that people are willing to go with me on that, especially in the politics department, and people are interested in those sort of conversations.
That's gorgeous. Thank you so much, Carl, for that. And Kelechi, your work's really interdisciplinary as well. You kind of work at this intersection of Black studies and the environmental humanities. So can you tell us a little bit more about kind of your research and how you came to it? Thank you.
So I actually started in a field that maybe you might want to call medical humanities. I was really interested in the idea of the cancer narrative and what this particular genre does, and you know that it has this particular kind of compelling kind of emotional register, and then I was interested in what kind of reading these cancer narratives provoke, and in kind of maybe thinking about the context in which they emerge, what kind of material conditions have to be in place for you to be able to write this book at a very challenging point in your life. And so that led me through to a kind of broader consideration of, well, what are the types of narratives that don't emerge? What are the types of narratives that are kind of occluded for whatever reason at this point? And thinking about broader forms of kind of inequality, including kind of environmental inequality that contribute to these kind of accruals of illness over generations often. And I was thinking about these kind of sites where these layers of history are kind of built upon on top of each other. So you've got the Denker industrial plant in the southern part of the US, on or near the site of a former plantation, but also in kind of proximity to kind of majority Black neighbourhoods who are all suffering in various ways from forms of exposure, well-known critics like Rob Nixon have spoken about this idea of slow violence and how. So I wanted to think about the kind of the health implications of environmental injustice. I'm really interested in how Black studies allows us to kind of think about. We've been talking about kind of escapism, but I'm really interested in kind of formulations of thinking about fugitivity, connecting that to this Fugitive Slave Act, and how forms of escape are about survival, and so these kind of apertures and these openings through which we can escape, we can imagine something different, are I think really important. Black studies gives you a language, I think, and quite a kind of interesting language to think about some of these ideas.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for telling us a little bit about your kind of academic and personal journeys and your political commitment as well to the work that you're doing. I think it would be appropriate now to give Carl a chance to respond to your many kind of provocations, which you very helpfully organised into 3 parts. I think it was kind of inversions, affordances of genre and plurality. I can either hand back to you, Kelechi, to remind Carl of a question or a topic, or just open the floor to you, Carl, if you're ready to get going.
Maybe if just a short response
sure.
to some of the questions, and then
sure, go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Such a very generous and really thought-provoking and fascinating comments and questions. Thank you ever so much. Lots for me to think about and reflect on and dwell upon. I think I love that framing of it in terms of inversions and what might be, both politically and also as scholars, what might be some of the radical inversions that the present moment opens for us. I think, as I said, that was one of the reasons I've been so drawn to someone like Nadia Korf, or you described the Book of Phoenix and the kind of radical immolation of Manhattan, but also the downfall of US imperialism and the construction of alternative climate futures in Sahelian North Africa. One of Okorafor's other books, Noor, has this revolutionary moment at the end. Spoiler alert: the lights are switched off, the power is turned off, and this is a strike against the system. And I think that kind of inversion is such an important move that is absolutely not present in any political strategies, even where you might look for kind of forms of radical politics. I mean, the ANC is still a liberation movement, but South Africa's national strategy doesn't talk about reparations or global transformation or any of these sorts of things, and so I think fiction brings that back in. But then it is also important to ask, well, what comes after, what happens after the revolution? So you know that the day after the revolution is when the real struggle begins, and some of this fiction does that in really interesting ways, whilst holding on to detritus in the past. So that image of an African archaeological team is just so fascinating, because that question for me is really important as well. What is some of the detritus, both literal and what aspect? I mean, plastic, Lego pieces apparently is what's going to survive us, but lots of these stories are also interested in that material detritus from contemporary life that will outlast us, but also the detritus in the sense of racism or misogyny. I mean, in modernization narratives, in ecological modernization narratives, the past is something that has to be cut off, decoupled, literally. The locomotive of progress has to decouple these sins of the past, whereas this fiction says, well, let's imagine a radical alternative future, but what elements of the past are still going to be cropping up and causing problems? In terms of the scholarly, a radical scholarly inversion is, we could maybe go back to this, but just maybe two other quick thoughts. I mean, great questions. The question of the tension between the sovereign statism of these national strategies and the transnational, international, global politics of climate change is a great question. I mean, this is a core question for international relations, my home discipline somehow, international politics. I have written a book on the green state in Africa, if anyone's interested in some of my takes on how this story of the sovereign autonomous state is itself a mythological narrative storyline. I mean, states are always embedded in transnational, I keep on saying transdisciplinary, transnational global power structures, and this is true for states everywhere, but when you look at post-colonial African states, this is so much more starkly visible. I mean, these are states that emerged into an international society that was never anarchic and sovereign. It was always hierarchical and gradated and unequal in all sorts of ways. Finally, then the question, excellent, really important political, perhaps one of the pressing political issues. Certainly when you see some of the debates playing out around fossil fuels and economic growth in places like Nigeria or South Africa, which is the context that perhaps I know the best. The question of, is this just another reason why development and modernity is deferred in the global South? And absolutely, the primary challenge is what developed global North European and North American countries do in their climate strategies. It matters a lot more what happens in the UK, France, Germany in terms of their US in terms of their extraction of fossil fuels than it does in Zimbabwe or Ethiopia. However, there are also I think this is where some kind of class analysis is really important as well, because there are sizable numbers of very wealthy people in places like Nigeria and South Africa who are enjoying the fruits of economic development and modernity and first world lifestyles, and it doesn't seem, let's put it at least like this, it doesn't seem clear to me that existing economic development models are ever really likely to make those lifestyles more readily available for the majority of people. So this is, in a sense, this is not something which is about to be handed over and is now being deferred. I think reading the kind of decolonial, degrowth literature, or colleagues working on things like radical abundance, what is really important and what these sort of stories can do is in some ways offer up the sort of visions that we need of how will our lives be better if we're not constantly flying internationally or buying iPhones and iPads. What sort of visions of the future can we imagine and articulate that have some kind of persuasiveness or appeal in all sorts of different economies and societies around the world, but which are reconcilable with the materialities of ecological crisis and climate change and so on. Thank you so much for your questions.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to respond then, Kelechi? Actually, give you the opportunity.
I think maybe you said, I think maybe either you wrote or used in the book, or well, definitely used in the book, but maybe you just said now this idea of kind of plausibility, and I think the kind of conjunction of bringing together kind of the policy and close reading the policy, and then kind of, engaging with something that is quite clearly very speculative and defamiliarized, I think really shifts the ground of plausibility, or kind of maybe exposes, or well, at least for me, made me kind of think about what is plausible in this context, and some of these narratives that you're kind of looking at from a kind of political perspective. Do we kind of believe them? And I think that's the central thing, the central struggle of politics, like the sense of kind of plausibility. So why not bring in the kind of speculative and reset the board in a sense around this question of kind of what is plausible? But yeah. Thank you.
It's really kind of amazing to kind of hear how wide-ranging this book is, and not only kind of thinking about these issues kind of from Africa to the world, and kind of, or nation to Africa to the world, but also across forms, I think is something that you raised as well, Kelechi. So I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more about the multi-generic nature of these texts. You're kind of categorising them as cli-fi, but they're all quite different. And how do you deal with that kind of formal range? What are the problems and challenges posed by that in your analysis?
Yeah, do you want this mic?
Thank you. So the book looks at 15 different African authors, and mainly novels. I started off primarily thinking this was going to be reliance on novels, but there are also short stories and a couple of films, Black Panther being the most well-known, but some other films in there as well. This question of genre and form is so important and interesting. I'm not sure I deal with it entirely adequately in the book, but I think it's I thought about it more and more as going into it, and I actually never used to really read a lot of short stories, whereas I've found that both the short stories themselves, anthologies on climate fiction, there's a lot of short stories out there now, but then there's also some really interesting arguments that are made either around what the form of a short story does in terms of being a more potentially subversive or radical form in terms of narrative structure and characterization and those sorts of things, and also the way in which, as I suggested earlier, short stories are very different commodities or products to a novel. I mean, most of all of the short stories in the book you can read for free online. You can read them on your phone whilst you're commuting. Whereas a lot of the novels that I look at in the book are explicitly gravitated towards novels that have been more successful and widely read, and there's this broader argument that you'll know very well about that extroverted African novel. There's a big market for African literature, world literature. The argument is often being made that these sorts of novels are written for a global audience, and whereas that may well be true of a lot of the short stories as well, but there are those who are arguing that some of these short story forms are more accessible, and maybe more the audience is more in terms of local people in Lagos reading short stories on their commute and so on. So there's those two different dimensions of the form question. In terms of what people, I didn't go into it as much in the book because I think they're really interesting, those arguments about how people read different stories and different forms and what the effects might be on them. And there's this fascinating literature that I've become aware of sort of reception studies of how people interpret and make meaning out of the stories they read. But I'm doing my own version of extraction in this project. I'm reading these stories as fuels for political theorising, which has the risk that sometimes these narratives and the differences between form get kind of blurred somewhat, and you draw out the thematic similarities in terms of places and ecologies and temporalities and politics, and that you see actually quite striking similarities across different forms in terms of the political implications, or the way in which we can take some of these stories and read them in terms of political theory. Yeah.
I mean, I thought that was something that was great out of the book, was that kind of levelling effect that you took. You're providing a side-by-side analysis of different forms of stories. So the political stories that were told and the literary stories that were told, and you're levelling that and you're reading them alongside one another. And I thought that was great, treating everything like a text, if you like, and not having that kind of hierarchy. What I am interested, though, in is the how you see African kind of cli-fi as distinct from other forms of cli-fi. Maybe that's a question as well for Kelechi. So maybe that's a question for you too. How does African climate fiction, how is it similar from or different to other forms of climate fiction?
I kind of want to be maybe the devil's advocate and say that perhaps it isn't so different, but the orientation maybe is different. There's a sense of kind of the subject that it addresses, or the subject that it kind of speaks from, that relationship might be different, but you have the same kind of thematic concerns, you have the same kind of dynamics of kind of violence that emerge, and I'm thinking here about some of the kind of connections that I was able to see between what is a kind of ostensibly a very distinctly kind of African futurist articulation of a climate future, but also kind of echoes and rhymes with Octavia Butler, with Samuel Delaney. So there's a kind of diasporic sensibility that then kind of challenges the kind of the insistence of a kind of very something that's specifically African, which there's the kind of anti-essentialist in me wants to say, but I do think that perhaps it's the kind of orientation for me that seems it's a kind of orientation that questions the kind of New York will be, and that's the kind of sense of the locus of the tragedy that's always happening to somebody who is positioned in a particular way, and extending or kind of questioning how we think about who is human, I think, yeah.
Thank you, yeah, a great question. I'd also love to ask you, Kelechi, what you think of some of the differences or a lot of similarities between climate fiction and the medical genres that you were working on before. I'll just throw that in there. In a way, a lot of the second half of the book is framed in terms of asking what is different about African or African futurist climate fiction. I don't write a lot in the book about mainstream climate fiction more generally, but I think that is quite useful to open that up as part of the discussion. And people may be familiar with the work of someone like Kim Stanley Robinson. Ministry for the Future is one of the most famous or well known in the last 5 or 6 years climate fiction novels. Ian McEwan, Cormac McCarthy, Bob Kingsolver, these sorts of the emerging canon of cli-fi. There are some areas in which I think there's a lot of similarities. I think in some respects I see a lot of similarities in terms of thinking about more than human or post-human politics. So Amitav Ghosh has been one of the most well-known exponents of this argument that climate fiction either should or needs to engage with, or is a form that is possible to think about in more than human, post-human terms, and you see that in lots of different examples of climate fiction from all over the world. I think there are I found some very striking differences between African futurist climate fiction and the let's just take those elderly white men, Kim Stanley Robinson and McCarthy and McEwen. I mean, at the level of where stories are set, at the level of the types of central narrators, whether they're middle-aged white scientists, usually men, very different sets of protagonists and characters in African futurist literature. This sense of Afrocentric global futures, I think, is obviously quite different. I think in terms of temporalities, both Afrofuturist and African futurist literatures have always been committed to the kind of interweaving and intertwining of past, present and future. So you get a complication of linear temporalities, which I think you can see in forms of climate fiction from elsewhere as well, but I think it's quite a distinctive form of, or a distinctive theme in African futurist climate fiction. I think the political, the revolutionary political question of reparations in the sense of what might it mean to not just solve climate change in the sense of greenhouse gas emissions, but how might we transform and repair a fundamentally violent the colonial wound, the trauma of the last 500 years of history. That theme in African futurist fiction, I think, is very different to what you get reading a lot of other climate fiction. But yeah, I'm also very open to the argument of looking for similarities instead of looking for differences. And whilst I went with and found quite persuasive Nadia Okorafor's argument about African futurism, that is also an argument that, I mean, given her own location and positionality in Korea, some African-based authors find it hard to take her stance on this at face value as well. And so I think there is a shared intellectual lineage in history that owes a lot to Delaney and Butler, just as much as it does to Motiongo and Benokri and people like that.
You've raised a point again that you've made kind of a few times, you've heard a few times, is this kind of this gap between like the page and action, and kind of making that kind of shift. And it's one that Kelechi also kind of raised, which was this challenge of kind of doing, even if you're doing kind of politically and ethically ambitious work, you're still bound by certain institutions and forms, like the academic book, for example. And I just wanted to kind of maybe take this in a slightly different direction, because by the end of the book, you offer us some solutions at the end of the book. And I think you say at the end, we can join a march, stand on a picket, organise a workplace or community, oppose drilling or logging or other forms of extraction, teach a classroom, reflect on how to repay your debts. And I think it's such a lovely way to end the book. But I just want to pick up on that teach a classroom as a form of action, of kind of getting from studying the literature to doing something, if you like. And I want to ask you kind of both a bit about that. So how your research informs your teaching. What do you teach in the classroom and how do you teach it? I can go to Kelechi first.
Maybe you can answer that first. I have to have a little think about it. Yeah, you go for it.
Well, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. Yeah, thank you for that. The question of the academic book, the physical object, the commodity, sort of thing that you spend this. I know exactly how long I've spent working on this book, because it was just before my second child was born, so she's just about to turn 7. So that's how long I've been working on this. And then you find the copy, and you have this excitement, and then you also, what was this all for? and who will read it and be interested in this? And an academic monograph that is never going to be on sale in a fantastic bookshop like this, is only ever going to be bought by a few university libraries. Hopefully more people will be interested and will want to discuss it and read it. So that the kind of what's the political, ethical, professional purpose of doing this is a really good question, and it's, of course, the process of writing the book is one output of that 7 years of thinking about this, and there are other forms of output or activity, praxis, if you like this, like writing blogs or doing podcasts or things like that. But teaching is a huge one for me, and I despite how enjoyable this setting is, I am someone who needs to be able to write in order to think. So you can't see all the frantic whirring in my head, but I'm not really thinking as I'm talking. I like to think whilst writing. So having written a book, this will change and structure my teaching for the next 10 years or so. This is and there's a lot to say here. And one perhaps obvious point of start, and maybe a difference between us given our different disciplines, is that in a politics classroom, it's lovely to be able to bring in films and novels and short stories. I think politics students sometimes, their enthusiasm to discuss cultural text may arise from a mistaken impression that this is somehow easier than discussing political strategies. They're certainly more enjoyable to read a lot of the time. It doesn't mean that they're easier to discuss and analyse, but I think for all sorts of reasons, both because also whether you're an activist, a policymaker, a student, a professional, a bureaucrat, lots of people enjoy reading and have an ability to, in some level, engage and discuss and debate the characters and plots in a fictional text, and so for some people that comes very easily to them. I think also teaching courses on both development studies, the politics of development, African politics, environmental politics. I mean, much of politics is fairly bleak a lot of the time. Teaching environmental politics at the moment is pretty, just levels of student anxiety, trauma, not just students, staff as well, thinking about ways in which to handle and process and discuss this within the classroom and within the course structure is really challenging. And it's too cliched and easy to finish off a course that discusses all the structural problems and then, let's read some utopian stories at the end. But giving students that kind of classic function of speculative fiction, the antidote to there is no alternative. It is possible to imagine alternative worlds, to defamiliarise the world around us. I think that is something that I've found really useful to feed into classes that I've taught in lots of different contexts.
Yeah, so I think I've found that students really appreciate a text that seems to speak. There's texts that are challenging, both in terms of kind of content, thinking about racial exclusion. Bringing that into the classroom is not without its challenges, but I do find that students are really hungry for something that seems to chime with the world around them. So I think, thinking about texts where, these kind of questions of trauma and violence and these kind of histories of exclusion are foregrounded, I think it makes for these really productive and enriching discussions. That's what I've always found in the classroom, is a kind of, such a live space. I think you quickly find out whether you're full of hot air or not, and it's a dialogue that kind of, I'm shaped completely by people who've taught me over the last however long it's been, and that was always for me the kind of the appeal of teaching, which is to kind of pass the gift along, really, of being able to kind of see the world in a different way. Yeah, maybe a bit idealistic.
It's clear you're both wonderful teachers. I have lots more questions, but I won't ask them. I will just ask one final short question before passing over to the audience. And the question is really, for anyone who's never read any African climate fiction before, what is the book they should start with and why? Go ahead, Carl.
This is a very, very difficult question. Thankfully, someone asked me this last week, so I've had some time to prepare, because my reaction to that was like, it's like being asked to choose my favourite child. There is an interest. I'm going to give a long answer now, aren't I? But there's a funny sense of writing a book about fictional stories that you read for pleasure initially, and spending 7 years writing about them and reading secondary literature on them and discussing them and pulling them apart. And I'd love to know whether you both find the same thing. It's quite hard to remember what I felt when I was reading them for the first time, or reading them for enjoyment. I mean, they have this strange status for me now. But I will answer the question, and I would say, I think Mediu Corafor's Who Fears Death is still, for me, one of the most powerful, awful, traumatic, but ultimately inspirational stories about a radically different climate future that I think is also beautifully written in lots of respects, and that would be the book that I would suggest people go to if they haven't read it before.
Well, I'm a literary studies person, but I don't know that I'm actually a kind of African climate fiction person. So as I said before, thinking about kind of non-fiction, life writing. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, yeah. Well, the book that's come to mind, it isn't African climate fiction per se, but going back to Leslie Necker Arena's collection, What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky, and the kind of really interesting kind of destabilizations that are evident in that short story collection. So yeah, kind of dodging the question slightly, but encouraging you all to read the collection. So it's really fantastic.
Thank you for those recommendations, which I said were for the audience, but the audience is in fact me. Okay, thank you all, everyone, for attending.